meeting will come to order. It's nice to have the Steve Turner, Northeastern State, in the audience today to advise us along our line, and we're very pleased to have the Patrick Shanahan, the Acting Secretary of Defense, General Joseph Dunford, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and David Norquist. And I have to say, David, I enjoyed our breakfast together the other day, and I think some people think it's pretty outrageous that we can actually have an audit. I'm glad that you're in charge of it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank the panel for their distinguished service to the country. And I'm pleased to see that the Department of Defense budget request for $718.3 billion and the overall national defense request of $750 billion. This amount is an increase of less than 3% of real growth. You know, we have this manual represents the blueprint that we're following right now. This was we had a hearing on this, and I think in all the years I've been here, this is the most productive hearing that we've had, where you had Democrats and Republicans alike and coming into an agreement on what our needs are to try to perform this function. Well, one of the things that is in this book that we all agreed to, and all the uniforms that came to our hearings agreed with this, was to have an increase while pulling out of this period of time and rebuilding our military would be between 3 and a 5% increase over inflation. Well, this 750 is actually less than 3% over inflation. So I just want to remind people of that. We didn't quite get to that point. The top line is only part of the story. We must ensure that we are effectively and efficiently spending the money, and that's why I want to commend you, Secretary Norquist, for all of your hard work delivering an audit of the Defense Department this year. It's something we haven't seen, and that audit should help us identify areas that need more attention and hold people accountable to spend the money more properly. Despite leadership changes at the Department of Defense, I believe the implementation of the National Defense Strategy should continue without pause. This is the book that we're referring to right here. And when President Trump came to office, he inherited an American military in crisis. Meanwhile, China and Russia were rapidly modernizing their militaries and actually passing us up in many areas. America's military advantage has eroded in key warfighting areas such as long-range ground-based fires, cyber, space, electronic warfare, as well as air and missile defense. The Commission on the National Defense Strategy, a bipartisan independent commission, stated, quote, put bluntly, the U.S. military could lose the next state versus state war that it fights, unquote. The conclusion of the 2018 National Defense Strategy states that we, and I'm quoting again, need urgent change at a significant scale to address strategic competition with China and Russia. I look forward to hearing what the urgent changes are and our witnesses what they recommend. Even the best prepared budget request will be meaningless if we don't reach a budget agreement soon. The Commission on the National Defense Strategy also stated that there must be, in another quote, there must be greater urgency and seriousness in funding the national defense. Without sufficient, sustained, and predictable funding, we'll squander the progress the military has made over the past 2 years. Improved readiness, increased procurement, and critical capabilities and investment in future technologies. I see no bigger imperative than this to reach a budget agreement immediately in order to fully fund defense and to fully implement the National Defense Strategy. Senator Reed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me join you in welcoming the witnesses, Secretary Shanahan and General Dunford and Secretary Norquist. Before we consider the details of the Defense Department's budget request, I'd like to address some of the broader fiscal challenges we face. Once again, we find ourselves in a situation all too familiar, debating how best to fund the government under the caps required by the Budget Control Act of 2011, the BCA. There is bipartisan consensus that enforcing budget discipline through the BCA and sequestration is ineffective and short-sighted, and that the BCA caps for fiscal year 2020 will deprive us of the resources needed to sufficiently meet the needs of our nation. last year because we had passed the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, and we knew the permitted spending parameters and therefore were able to mark up and pass the fiscal year 2019 defense authorization and appropriations bills before September 30th. This gave the military the funding certainty that it has lacked for many years. I believe Congress should pass another 2-year budget agreement to provide further relief on the caps and provide stability for budget planning. Without such an agreement, we will face great difficulty in crafting a bipartisan authorization bill and will be hard-pressed to provide the Defense Department with another on-time appropriation. Delay will likely lead to recurring continuing resolutions that disrupt planning and, ironically, add cost and inhibit readiness and modernization, and to the Chairman's point, undermine that sense of certainty that is probably worth billions of dollars in budget authority. So I would urge that we do that. Today, we consider the fiscal year 2020 budget for the Department of Defense, which seeks $544.5 billion for the base budget and $164.6 billion in overseas contingency operations, OCO, of which $97.9 billion is designated to pay for base requirements. In addition, there is another $9.2 billion requested for emergency funding. In its base budget request, the Defense Department highlights resources intended to prioritize programs targeted for the high-end fight against near-peer competitors and to operationalize the National Defense Strategy, including investments in the space and cyber domains, larger purchases of aircraft, ships, and munitions, and increased research and development dollars for unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, hypersonics, and directed energy. The base budget request also supports the quality of life of our service members by sustaining family support initiatives and by authorizing a 3.1% pay raise, the largest in 10 years. However, it is clear that the base budget request will not cover all of the Defense Department's requirements, so we've been presented with a particularly egregious misuse of the OCO account. I acknowledge that both Congress and other administrations in the past have included elements of base funding in OCO accounts, but overloading the OCO request with $97.9 billion worth of activities that truly belong in the base budget just to avoid the threshold of the BCA cap far exceeds any precedent and it cannot be justified. Ironically, last year the President's acting Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, called for a, in his words, transition away from using OCO as a gimmick to avoid the sequestration caps, close quote, in his testimony before Congress. And yet this defense budget is a prime example of such a use and undercuts the integrity of the entire request. I'd also highlight that Section 1524 of the FY18 Defense Authorization Act directed the Defense Department to update the guidelines regarding the budget items that may be covered by OCO. Neither OMB nor the Defense Department have updated these guidelines. I hope our witnesses shed some light on when this will be done and what the details are of this OCO for base request. I also have serious concerns with the $9.2 billion requested in emergency funding for unspecified military construction projects. $3.6 billion of that total is intended to replenish funds that may be diverted from military construction projects that Congress already authorized and appropriated to build a wall on the southern border. Even if this funding is replenished, these projects may be delayed or even canceled. I would also like to note that Congress has not yet been given the list of projects whose funding may be diverted, and I'm interested if the witnesses can provide some information on that list. Moreover, we will learn that an additional $3.6 billion of emergency funding in the Defense Department's budget will be used to build more of the wall, projects that have not been identified in any way and arguably have zero military utility. Much of our witnesses' testimony today describes the $750 billion in investments needed to fulfill the National Defense Strategy. But the National Defense Strategy Commission, as the Chairman cites, is authoritative in their comments, noted that comprehensive challenges will require whole-of-government and even whole-of-nation cooperation, extending far beyond DOD. Diplomatic statecraft and other non-military tools will be critical, so will adequate support for funding for those elements of American power. With the State Department and other agencies facing drastic cuts in this budget request, I'm interested to know if the Defense Department will truly be able to realize the National Defense Strategy. It is the duty of this committee to ensure the men and women we send into harm's way have the resources necessary to complete their mission and return home safely. But I firmly believe if the Senate decides to modify the budget caps for FY20, we must do so in a manner that continues to provide sufficient funding for both defense and non-defense as we have done every other time we've adjusted the caps. I'm proud that this committee has always worked in a bipartisan fashion during this process. I look forward to working with all the committees to come to a reasonable agreement again this year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reid. We'll now have opening statements by both the Secretary and General Dunford. And your entire statement will be made a part of the record, but if you can hold it down to around 5 minutes. We have a full House today, and we want to get to questions by all of our members on both sides. So we'll start with you, Secretary Shanahan.
Thank you, Chairman Inhofe and Ranking Member Reid, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2020. I'm joined by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, and the Department's Comptroller and Chief Financial Officer, Mr. David Norquist. During my time at the Department of Defense, I've engaged in substantive discussions with many of you. In our conversations, there has been an enduring constant. That is, the bipartisan nature of defense, proved by the sustained funding increases Congress has provided the last 2 years. On behalf of our military's selfless patriots, thank you. It has been a great privilege and honor to serve alongside the men and women of the Department of Defense. And it was a pleasure to work with Secretary Mattis to craft the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Released in January of 2018, that strategy laid the foundation for restoring military readiness and modernizing our joint force for an era of great power competition. I now oversee the continued execution of our strategy, which is the undisputed driver of today's budget request. It was extremely helpful for the Department to receive the authorization and appropriation bills on time and at the requested top line last year. That is equally important this year, as our competitors have not been complacent. China's defense spending approaches that of the United States when we take into account purchasing power and the portion of our budget going to military pay and benefits. That, coupled with China's organized approach to steal foreign technology, has allowed China to modernize its missile, space, and cyber capabilities, as well as project power far beyond its borders. Russia, for its part, continues to compete asymmetrically with the United States, modernizing and developing its own missile, space, and cyber capabilities. Simultaneously, North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles remain a pressing concern. Iran's missile and cyber threats and malign aggression across the Middle East and beyond threaten U.S. national interests. And we know what violent extremist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS continue to foment instability in vulnerable areas. We have seen marked progress in our current operations as we work by, with, and through an expansive network of allies and partners across the globe. In Syria, the 79-member Defeat ISIS coalition has liberated virtually all of the territory ISIS once held. As the U.S. drawdown continues, we will maintain a presence to prevent ISIS resurgence. As part of a whole-of-government approach, we fully support Iraq's fight against terrorism, and we continue to enable the Iraqi security forces' progress in securing liberated areas and thwarting ISIS's attempts to mount a clandestine insurgency. In Afghanistan, U.S. and coalition forces are training, advising, and assisting Afghan forces to apply pressure on the Taliban. We support the ongoing negotiations, the best window for peace there in 40 years, and continue to stymie terrorist threats to our homeland. Defeating al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS remains the top U.S. national security interest in Yemen. At the same time, we fully support UN efforts to bring all relevant parties of the civil war to the negotiating table. The $750 billion top line for the national defense enables DOD to maintain irregular warfare as a core competency, yet prioritize modernization and readiness to compete, deter, and win in any possible high-end fight of the future. The budget is critical for continued execution of our strategy and reflects difficult but necessary choices that align finite resources with our strategic priorities. To highlight some of those choices, this is the largest research, development, training, and evaluation budget in 70 years. The budget includes double-digit increases to our investments in both space and cyber, modernization of our nuclear triad and missile defense capabilities, and our largest shipbuilding request in 20 years when adjusted for inflation. It also increases our total end strength by roughly 7,700 service members and provides a 3.1% pay increase to our military, the largest in a decade. Now to the specifics. The top line slates $718 billion for the Department of Defense. Of that total, the budget includes $545 billion for base funding and $164 billion for the overseas contingency operations. Of the overseas contingency operation funds, $66 billion will go to direct war and enduring requirements, and $98 billion will fund base requirements. To round out the numbers, $9.2 billion will fund emergency construction. That includes an estimated $2 billion to rebuild facilities damaged by hurricanes Florence and Michael. Up to $3.6 billion to support military construction projects that will award in fiscal year 2020 instead of fiscal year 2019, so we can resource border barrier projects under emergency declaration this year, and $3.6 billion in case additional emergency funding is needed for the border. Military construction on the border will not come at the expense of our people, our readiness, or our modernization. I caution that no adversary can be as damaging to our military readiness as budget instability. We built this budget to implement the National Defense Strategy, and I look forward to working with you to ensure predictability, on-time funding at our requested top line so our military can remain the most lethal, adaptable, and resilient fighting force in the world. I close with the words of William Jennings Bryan, etched into the walls of our Capitol so we may never forget their meaning. Our government conceived in freedom and purchased with blood can be preserved only by constant vigilance. Senators, I appreciate the critical role Congress plays to ensure our warfighters can succeed on the battlefields of both today and tomorrow. And I thank our service members, their families, and all those in the Department of Defense for maintaining the constant vigilance as they stand always ready to protect freedoms.
Thank you, Secretary Shanahan. General Dunford.
Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Shanahan and Undersecretary Norquist here today. It remains my privilege to represent your soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Well, much of the discussion this morning is going to focus on the challenges we face. It's important I begin by assuring you that your armed forces can deter a nuclear attack, defend the homeland, meet our alliance commitments, and effectively respond should deterrence fail. I believe we have a competitive advantage against any potential adversary, defined as the ability to project power to fight and win at the time and place of our choosing. But as members of this committee know, 17 years of continuous combat and fiscal instability have affected our readiness and eroded our competitive advantage. As the Secretary highlighted, China and Russia have capitalized on our distraction and restraints by investing in capabilities specifically designed to challenge our traditional sources of strength. After careful study, the deployed capabilities intended to contest our freedom of movement across all domains and disrupt our ability to project power. With the help of Congress, starting in 2017, we began to restore our competitive advantage. Recent budgets have allowed us to build readiness and invest in new capabilities while meeting our current operational commitments. But I think we all know we can't reverse decades of erosion in just a few years. This year's budget submission would allow us to continue restoring our competitive advantage by improving readiness and developing capabilities to enhance our lethality. It proposes investments in advanced capabilities across all domains: sea, air, land, space, and cyberspace. This year's budget also sustains investments in our nuclear enterprise to ensure a safe, secure, and effective strategic deterrent, the highest priority for the Department of Defense. We've also taken steps to more effectively employ the force we have today and build the force we have tomorrow. We've implemented fundamental changes in our global force management processes to prioritize and allocate resources in accordance with the National Defense Strategy while building readiness and the flexibility to respond to unforeseen contingencies. We've also refined our processes for developing and designing our future force, a joint concept-driven, threat-informed approach which leverages a wide body of analytic work will allow us to deliberately evaluate and prioritize warfighting requirements. This also enables us to pair emerging technologies with innovative operating concepts. In closing, I'd like to thank the committee for all you've done to support our men and women in uniform and their families. Together, we've honored our solemn obligation to never send our sons and daughters into a fair fight, and with your continued support, we never will.
Yeah, thank you, General. What we're going to do is have a round of 5-minute questions. And we are very well attended this morning, so I ask people to try to keep within their time. I would do the same thing. To kick it off, we talked about our blueprint that we're using, and I'd like to ask each witness a question about this. Secretary Shanahan, you've said that the Department of Defense would realign the resources in the budget to implement this program. Now, in order to do that, can you quickly run over any of the programs or systems or missions that have been either reduced or accelerated to accommodate this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would highlight in this year's budget 3 major structural changes in terms of being able to accelerate. The first is space. The Space Force itself is intended to accelerate dramatically our capabilities to defend. Second, missiles. Probably the best characterization of that is our efforts on hypersonics. And third, a significant investment in cyber capabilities. When we think about reductions, I think the Army is the best illustration of that in their modernization plans as they look to make reductions across their portfolio to, I'll say, about 100 different programs.
Okay, appreciate that. General Dunford, similar question. The National Defense Strategy Commission listed several capability gaps vis-a-vis China and Russia, such as long-range fires, additional air defense units, and others that I mentioned in my overstatement. Which of these capability gaps do you think the 2020 budget addresses?
Chairman, thank you. The budget actually addresses all the challenges you identified, and what I can assure you is that the National Defense Strategy really has been the basis for our prioritization for capability development. So we did careful analysis of China and Russia in particular, the capabilities developed over the last few years to limit our ability to operate freely in space, cyberspace, land, sea, and air. And the capabilities that we have identified in this year's budget are really designed to allow us to project power when and where necessary to advance our interests in the context of that emerging threat for China and Russia.
All right, I appreciate that. Now, I am concerned about one other area, and neither one of you is personally responsible for this, but I'm a little disturbed by the idea that we're going to be taking the USS Truman out of the system, and I wonder how this is going to work in just our sheer numbers. Now, we have a law that says we have to maintain 11 carriers, and we would also look at this and realize that 10 would equal what's necessary to conduct a major war. And how do we get to the number we're supposed to have if we don't follow through with the midlife of the Truman? Now, recognizing that would take up to, I think, 2024, but nonetheless, it's going to take longer if we start depending upon the multiple buy that we're talking about, particularly of a vehicle that still, the elevator still doesn't work and carry the ordnance. So what's your thought about that? How are we going to, number one, comply with the law that we have? In fact, Mr. Norquist, this might be a good question for you because you're into these issues also, and still not follow through with our original plans with the Harry Truman. Anybody?
Why don't I lead off? First of all, I think the Truman decision represents some of the strategic choices we made in this year's budget. It was a very difficult decision for us, Carriers represent now and in the future critical force structure for the Navy. The Truman decision was made in concert. It was an integrated decision with our 2-carrier buy. Let me walk through the benefits of the decision and then potential off-ramps so that we don't find ourselves in a difficult situation. So the first is that with this decision of the 2-carrier buy and to not refuel the Truman, our lethality of our carriers and capability increases with the new carriers. The second is until mid-20s, we maintain the level of 11 carriers. The third is, and part of the calculus here was to maintain employment. In fact, with this decision, we grow employment in the industrial base. We needed to make sure not only that our shipyards maintained their employment, there's actually growth, but also the supply chain. And the last is that the funds that we freed up for making these decisions are invested in the future force. The decision for 2 carriers saved $4 billion.
Yeah.
Not refueling the Truman saves $3.4 billion over the fight up.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to run out of time, and I'm going to set the example of not allowing us to run out of time. But I still am not happy with the results of that, and my mental numbers don't agree with that, and I think it's a very important thing. I personally brought this up before Wicker gets here.
Yeah.
All right. Senator Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all, gentlemen, for your testimony. Mr. Secretary, on February 18th, you sent a letter to Secretary Nielsen stating that you had, in your words, not yet decided whether the use of Section 2808 is necessary. That would be the section under the emergency that would authorize access to MILCON funds. And you've asked for information from the Secretary to include a list of proposed border construction projects that would improve the, again, your words, effectiveness and efficiency of DOD personnel supporting these Customs and Border Patrol. Have you received a response yet from Secretary Nielsen?
No, I have not. I expect it this week.
Again, in the context of something that is supposed to be an emergency, this seems to be a pretty casual sort of approach to the issue. But beside that, at this point, then, you don't know what projects DAS is requesting and whether or not those projects would be appropriate under 2808.
Yeah, the projects we've received or the updates from DHS to date are on with regards to their 2019 appropriations. They're for the expenditure of forfeiture of Treasury funds, and then needs as a...
Those are all programs that are automatic. You've already put those. I'm talking about the 2808, which would require not only the emergency declaration, but also a judgment whether their military utility. And Mr. Chairman, General Dunford, you have the obligation to advise the Secretary on the military utility of these projects if they're being incorporated. What criteria do you intend to use?
Thanks, Senator Reed. The criteria I intend to use is we'll look carefully at the mission that our soldiers, sailors, Marines have been assigned, some airmen as well, and we'll look at how these projects support directly the mission of those individuals.
Thank you. And the Secretary will make the ultimate decision, but based upon your recommendation.
Senator, I'll be one of the inputs, and I'll provide military advice to the Secretary on the relationship between the resources, the projects, and the mission.
If it comes to pass, then you'll have to delay certain military construction projects we've authorized and appropriated. Do you have a list of those projects yet, Mr. Secretary?
Senator, I don't have a final list of those projects.
Well, obviously, I think it'd be important to all of us to understand which projects would be sacrificed even in the short run. So I would encourage you to get that list. In the emergency request, there's $3.6 billion for essentially backfilling those projects which have already been authorized and appropriated, which is, I think, an unusual way to fund military construction projects. But then there's an additional $3.6 billion that's just been set aside for the wall, competing with other potential military projects. That's emergency funding. Do you think that's appropriate?
It was appropriate given the planning when we were putting the budget together, to provision for the next year. And I'm going to ask Secretary Norquist to comment about how we came up with the planning.
Sure. One of the things we wanted to be certain to do is to not disrupt future military construction projects. So if 2808 extends, which it will into fiscal year 20, just because at least it's a 12 months, if it's longer, we don't want that to disrupt other projects. So we put in funding so that it would be available and not to be able to, in order to be able to protect the other military construction projects.
But essentially what you're doing is creating appropriations dedicated at this point to building the wall, which is not, I think, been authorized or appropriated by the Congress. That 3.6 extra funding, you know, is going to the wall. It might be a backfill or a circuitous way, but it's essentially for the wall. Is that correct?
Right. It's in the request, and therefore it would need to be both authorized and appropriated to take effect.
So,
absolutely, sir.
So that in our process, we are authorizing, you're asking us literally to authorize funding for the wall.
Yes.
Thank you. Just a quick question, because I want to follow the Chairman's guidelines. You mentioned $2 billion in the emergency request for hurricane reconstruction. The Marine Corps has indicated to me as late as yesterday that it's about $3.7 billion. Tyndall Air Force Base is between $4 and $5 billion. So it would seem to me, if you're trying to address the real needs of the Department of Defense, that instead of using 3.6 or $7 billion for the wall, that could be used immediately for repairs at Camp Lejeune and Tyndall Air Force Base.
So what you have is, yes, there are significant requirements for both of those two bases. One of the things we're looking at is particularly the military construction projects. The planning and design lead means that some of them can be executed in 20, so we have $2 billion in for that. Some of them won't be able to be executed till 21 or later. And so we're trying to balance that and address those. But we're happy to work with you on those requirements.
Respecting the Chairman, aye.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, do you believe a no first use policy improves our ability to deter conflict, and would it be your best military advice to adopt such a policy?
No, thank you, Senator. I think the current policy is one that complicates an adversary's decision-making process, and I wouldn't recommend any change to simplify an adversary's decision-making calculus. I also can envision several circumstances where we would not want to remove that option from the President in the future, and I could certainly talk about that in a classified venue, but I absolutely believe the current policy is the right policy.
Thank you. As you know, those who favor reducing the size of our nuclear forces, they often argue that a non-nuclear capability can be substituted for nuclear weapons without diminishing our ability to credibly hold targets at risk, deter adversaries, and assure our allies. A report released last September by the Global Zero Group repeatedly makes this argument and claims that cyber weapons, in particular, can be substituted for nuclear weapons. Do you think cyber operations, their effects, and their ability to deter hostile activity is comparable to nuclear weapons, or are these extremely different capabilities? And is this idea of direct substitution unwise?
Senator, I don't believe that cyber capabilities can be substituted for nuclear capabilities, and I think we need to be very careful to maintain a safe, effective, and credible nuclear deterrent on its own. We, as you know, have looked at this through more than 3 or 4 administrations in a row. We've carefully looked at what does the nation need to do what I described in my opening statement as the most important mission in the Department of Defense, and that is to deter a nuclear war. And we've concluded that the current construct of the triad with a robust nuclear command and control capability is the most effective way to deter a nuclear war. And it is also the most effective way to raise the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons by any potential adversary.
And you mentioned that in order to maintain that safe deterrent, we must follow the advice of all previous administrations, both Republican and Democrat, all previous military leaders, that we maintain that triad?
Yes, Senator, and I have participated in 2 nuclear posture reviews since I've been in this assignment and been exposed to the wide body of analytic work that was behind those 2 nuclear posture reviews that came to the very same conclusion in 2 different administrations, and it's very consistent with the military advice that I provided on both occasions.
Thank you. Moving to a different topic, late last year, General, you characterized the situation in Afghanistan as a stalemate. In the time since, we've seen some indications that negotiations with the Taliban are showing signs of progress. Do you believe the South Asia strategy is working? And what is your view of the current security situation?
Well, thanks, Senator. First, I think we're all cautiously optimistic that there is, for the first time, serious inroads made into reconciliation. And Ambassador Khalilzad just completed a round of negotiations with the Taliban. He's back in Washington, D.C. I'll have an opportunity to speak to him later today, and I think we'll see him tomorrow morning. And we're encouraged, and I can tell you on behalf of Secretary Shanahan, everything that we are doing now in the military space, led by General Miller on the ground, is in support of Ambassador Khalilzad's efforts. I think on the ground, by and large, the general strategic situation has not changed, but General Miller has incorporated elements of the strategy to increase the pressure on Taliban leadership, and we do believe that some of that pressure has contributed to the fact that the Taliban are now at the peace table for the first time since the war began.
What conditions on the ground do you believe are necessary if we're going to be able to see any kind of progress in discussions that we have with the Taliban? Can you be specific in this setting?
Yeah, first, to put pressure on the Taliban, we need to continue to provide enabling capability to the Afghan forces. That's been in the form of train, advise, and assist. We have the right leaders at the right place to assist the Afghans, and we're also providing combat enabling capability, aviation, intelligence, logistics support as well. And then most importantly, though, Senator, on the ground is a counterterrorism capability, remembering that the reason why we're in Afghanistan is to prevent attacks against the American people in the homeland. And so the combination of support for the Afghans to allow them to put pressure on the Taliban also creates the conditions for us to have an effective counterterrorism presence in South Asia to secure the American people.
Thank you. I think it's important to always consider conditions on the ground and always keep in mind what our goal and mission is. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Shanahan? I'm sorry.
Shaheen.
There we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been on this committee for about 8 years now.
That's it. These Irish names are tough, Jim.
Yeah, actually, that's right.
These Irish names.
St. Patrick's Day is coming up, so for that I'll be Sheehan.
Your troll? Yes.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Secretary Shanahan, I must say I was quite concerned this morning when I read the New York Times story that the Department of Defense is pushing back against the Environmental Protection Agency, which is trying to set tougher standards for PFAS chemicals. And I will just show you, the article was in the Times, and the headline here says, Pentagon pushes for weaker standards on chemicals contaminating drinking water. You and I first had a chance to talk about PFAS chemicals and how they're affecting the former Pease Air Force Base in 2017. And I told you about the hundreds of people, children, who had been drinking water, and those chemicals now have shown up, and no one knows what the long-term health impacts of drinking that water is. There are 401 known military facilities in the United States that the Pentagon has admitted have PFAS contamination. This committee worked 2 years ago to authorize the first ever health study on PFAS chemicals. And I'm very concerned about the fact that the Department of Defense would be trying to reduce the standard that the EPA is setting to try and ensure that drinking water is safe, not just for the civilians around our military installations, but for our members of the military. I must say the Air Force has been very responsive at Pease and Portsmouth under the previous Secretary, Deborah James, and the current Secretary, Heather Wilson. They have come up, they have put in remediation efforts, and I think this health study that has been started is going to be critical in answering questions for people. But I don't understand how you and the Department of Defense could be trying to reduce the standards that affect drinking water for literally millions of people around the country.
Senator, I'm not familiar with the article this morning, and you have my assurance that I'll take a look at what the actual situation is in terms of the standards. What I am is accountable and responsible for the safety and security of our men and women. You have my assurance that we will continue to do that. I will look into this matter. I take these matters personally very, very seriously, just as we had talked before. I am the advocate to take care of those matters. So let me take that for the record, and I will follow up with you directly to explain the situation, what we're doing to take responsibility.
Well, I appreciate that. Can you confirm or deny whether DOD has urged a lowering of the standard that the EPA is trying to put in place?
I can't speak to that specific. I will very quickly get an answer back to you.
I appreciate that. I think that's something that is important for the entire committee to know because, as you know, installations across the country are affected, and a lot of and we don't yet really know what the long-term health impacts are. So getting those answers is very important. Can I ask, and I'm not sure who quite to direct this question to, but General Dunford, you said that you were going to be weighing in on any projects that were put on a list, any MILCON projects put on a list to consider delaying because of the President's effort to put more money into a border wall. Can you tell me what objective criteria that you're looking at in trying to come up with those projects?
Senator, the Secretary will get inputs on the impact of the projects from the service secretaries and the service chiefs. What I will do is talk about the appropriateness of those projects and how they relate to the performance of our mission along the border. So the Secretary will get a wide variety of inputs, and each of the service secretaries, I know, will share their assessment of the impact of those projects to the Secretary.
But a number of those projects would not affect the border, would they?
No,
I mean, we have MILCON projects at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard that are very important, I think, to our national security that don't affect the border directly.
Yeah, sorry, Senator, if I conflated two issues. There's the list of projects, and then the service that may be used to free money up for projects along the border. The service secretaries and the service chiefs will provide input to the Secretary on the impact of those projects to the services. And as you point out, bases and installations maybe where those projects would have been executed. What I will do when the decision is made to support the border with infrastructure is assess the relationship of that infrastructure to the DOD mission. There's two separate processes that affect infrastructure and projects.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Cotton.
General Dunford, how many troops roughly do we have on the border today?
Senator, we have approximately 4,000 in a Title 10 status, and we have approximately 2,000 in a Title 32 status.
How many do we have in the DMZ on the Korean Peninsula?
We have a total of 28,500 in Korea.
And they're all pretty close to the DMZ, but we have a lot that are right up on the DMZ too, correct?
We do, Senator.
How many do we have today in the Baltics and Poland, nations that border Russia?
We have several hundred, and then, of course, in Poland, we have a constant rotational presence that can be up in the thousands. We have brigade combat teams that rotate into Poland for training. I was there visiting them in December, and at that point, we had probably about 3,000 forces inside of Poland at that time.
Okay, so we have lots of troops around the world on other countries' borders. Does it cause you any disquiet that we have troops on our own border?
It does not cause me disquiet that we have troops on the border, Senator.
Thank you. Let's turn to the budget. The budget has a very large request for the Overseas Contingency Fund, $174 billion. I think that's probably about $100 billion more now than what we've spent this year. That obviously is a big patch to try to get around the Budget Control Act of 2011. There's a lot of people on Capitol Hill who are not going to like that, but let's think about it first from a military standpoint. General Dunford, what does it mean for modernization if the opposition to such a large overseas contingency fund results in a one-year continuing resolution?
Well, Senator, my understanding this year would be that we would not have a continuing resolution, that we would go back to BCA levels. And I'm not given the hyperbole.
Well, so let's say it's a continuing resolution that suspends the BCA levels. So because of the dispute over the Overseas Contingencies Fund, the Congress can't reach a budget cap agreement, and therefore we have to have a one-year continuing resolution that suspends the caps.
And one of the challenges that we've had, Senator, over the last few years is the fact that we have not had a budget. Last year we did, but the fact that we have routinely not had a budget at the beginning of the year has delayed new starts, and it's been incredibly inefficient in how we prioritize and allocate resources throughout the year. And the three adjectives I use, and I think they're all important, is predictable, sustained, and adequate levels of funding. And if we have the entire fiscal year, we can be the good stewards that you should hold us accountable for being.
And Secretary Shanahan, is $1 of spending in the Overseas Contingency Fund equal to $1 of spending in the base budget?
Senator, yes, it is.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
When I think about the top line and how we built the top line, it was a requirements-built budget. So every dollar in the budget is based off a derived requirement. So how we package the money doesn't change how we built the budget. So the color is indifferent to what it is we would put the money towards.
If the Congress could reach a budget cap deal, though, and have that money in the base budget, would that be better off for the Department of Defense?
Be much better off.
Can you explain why that would be better off?
So for a number of reasons, I think and I'll ask David to comment on this, but it's in the out years when the base budget gives us the predictability and the stability the chairman just spoke to. That not only gives us internally the stability to do our planning, but also our partners and the industrial base, their investment and their planning and their sizing, they have confidence that that continuity of money will continue. David?
Yeah, that's probably a good question for the comptroller. Could you just explain the efficiency of spending $1 in the base budget versus $1 in the OCO budget, especially in the out years?
So in the regular year, they follow the same congressional oversight. They get spent the same way. It's a presentation difference. And to be clear to the members, we have presented the budget so that that which has historically been OCO is distinctly presented from the OCO for base, because we want to understand to be able to do analysis, you need to be able to comparison. But when you go to the out years, what people look at is what numbers can we expect in the out years. It is easier to project, and we have done that in the past, and you'll see in some of our presentations a different base and OCO mix in the out years when you get to the point where all that is OCO is the contingency versus the OCO for base and others. But it's it helps with planning.
Yeah, I'd say the reason we're in this bind is a law against which I have inveighed for many years, the 2011 Budget Control Act. I hope that we can get another and final two-year cap deal. I do worry, though, that we may be heading in the direction of a full-year continuing resolution, and I would hate to see that for all our men and women in uniform out on the front lines. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Hirono.
I thought Senator Blumenthal was here before me, so I'll defer to him first.
Okay, Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There last. Go. Switch her to last.
Take the ball and run.
Go.
Good morning, gentlemen, and thank you very much for your service. Appreciate your being here and your candid and forthright answers. President Trump's budget has been criticized in many ways, and in my view, it gets a lot wrong, but it got very right the commitment to undersea warfare and building 3 submarines, Virginia-class attack submarines a year in fiscal 2020, and I want to thank you and your entire team for their commitment to that issue of paramount importance to our future Navy and our national defense. It is an area where we have an asymmetric advantage that must be preserved. There are others that are also important, like cyber and air superiority and space, for all the reasons that you know. But I just want to highlight that area. I want to ask a question that is unrelated to the defense budget, but is very much on the minds of many of us, relating to the Boeing 737 MAX 8. I know it's not a topic of interest today before this proceeding, but it is a topic of interest to work that you've done in the past. And I'd like to know whether you have spoken about the Boeing 737 MAX 8 to anyone in the administration, in the Department of Transportation, or in the White House.
Senator, I've not spoken to anyone regarding the 737 MAX.
Have you been briefed at all on any of the problems relating to it?
No, sir, I have not.
Let me ask you, are you in favor of an investigation that would look into why these defects that caused crashes were not known earlier or were not acted upon earlier?
Senator, I firmly believe we should let the regulators investigate the incidents. And I would just say my heart goes out and my condolences to the families and the employees involved in the Lion Air incident and the Ethiopian airline incident.
The independent watchdog Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington recently asked the Department of Defense Inspector General to investigate whether you have broken any ethics rules by promoting Boeing while you served as Deputy Secretary of Defense. Do you support such an investigation?
Yes, I do.
And I welcome your support for that investigation. Other government watchdog groups have looked at records indicating that the Department of Defense spent almost $140,000 at Trump-branded properties in the first 8 months of the Trump presidency. More than a third of those payments were made at Mar-a-Lago. Some of the payments overlap with presidential trips, but others do not. And all of the payments, you may be familiar with the emoluments lawsuit that I and other members of Congress have brought, would violate that domestic emoluments clause potentially, which prevents the President from receiving money from the federal government or any other payments and benefits without consent of Congress. Are you aware of those expenditures by the Department of Defense?
No, I'm not, but I'll ask Secretary Norquist.
I'm not aware of those.
Could you give us in writing an accounting of those expenditures by the Department of Defense at Trump-branded properties?
I'll take that for the record, Senator.
Thank you. As the acting Secretary of the Department of Defense, I have been alarmed by reports that indicate a pattern of retaliation against some of the Pentagon reporters and restricted press access to some of the top DOD officials. Are you aware of those restrictions, and do you think they're appropriate?
I'm not aware of any restrictions. In fact, I think there's probably, since I've assumed these responsibilities, much more interaction and engagement with the press.
Well, if you could, since my time has expired, if you could let me know of any restrictions that have been imposed, for the record, if you would take that question. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. President, or thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of Irish mistakes going on here this morning.
great day for the Irish.
Maybe we're getting close to St. Patrick's Day or something. I want to thank you, all you gentlemen, for your service. Undersecretary Norquist, I know Senator Perdue is going to ask a lot about the audit, but I think that was really good work that you were doing. And General Dunford, I just want to thank you. You know, I know that there's been an announcement of a new chairman, but certainly we view you as the chairman who's done an exceptional job, not just as chairman, but in your entire career. I know you got a lot of work to do left, but I do want to do a shout out to your exceptional service to our nation. Mr. Secretary, I want to ask a couple questions that relate to the President's recent visit to Alaska. He was there coming back from North Korea. Billy Mitchell, who's the father of the U.S. Air Force, in a congressional hearing similar to this, right before World War II, called Alaska the most strategic place in the world. The President kind of echoed Billy Mitchell's comments when he was in Alaska visiting with our troops. He said, "Since the Second World War, our intrepid service members in Alaska have proudly stood as the top cover for North America. You are a powerful warning to the world to never strike American soil. You are a warning that everybody knows about and nobody wants to mess with." He went on to say, he was at JBER, "Next year, the 11th Air Force, headquartered right here at JBER, will receive the first of 54 brand new F-35 fighters. You are getting very special planes, and you're getting a lot of them. That'll make Alaska the home to over 100 fifth-gen fighters. No place on the planet Earth will have that much combat fighter power, and it's because of our strategic location." The President then went on to talk about Alaska's critical role in missile defense. "We are also deploying more than 20 ground-based interceptors at Fort Greely, which will further strengthen our missile defense system." So important. Our missile defense system is being rebuilt very substantially, and we're going to have the latest and greatest here very soon. So that was President 2 weeks ago in Alaska. So do you agree with these statements by the President, Mr. Secretary?
Senator, I do.
You called North Korea pressing concern, like the President indicated by his remarks. Do you believe that the rapid deployment of advanced missile defense for America is critical to our readiness in defending from North Korea missile attacks?
Extremely critical.
How about the rapid deployment of 100 fifth-gen fighters that can be defending our troops in Korea because of Alaska's strategic location within 5 hours?
Deployment and sustainment of them is vital.
Thank you. Let me ask on the issue of allies. Do you agree that China and Russia have been trying for years to split us from our traditional allies? NATO, Japan, Korea. Hasn't that been a strategic goal of them, of those countries?
Well, China in particular, but we see this constantly with Russia and NATO, particularly in the Balkans. I'd ask the chairman maybe to comment on the recent activity in the Balkans.
Well, just, General Dunford, you see that as a strategic goal of the Chinese and the Russians to split us from our allies?
It's been a very consistent pattern of behavior to split us from our allies, and more specifically, to create doubt in the minds of our allies that we can meet our alliance commitments.
So I appreciate what the President's been trying to do, particularly get our NATO allies to 2%. But there have been press reports about a cost plus 50% approach. Mr. Secretary, do you know how much the Koreans paid for the new Camp Humphreys on the Korean Peninsula?
I do. Slightly less than $1 billion.
So they paid $9.8 billion out of a new facility cost $10.8 billion. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
93% of a U.S. Army base.
Right.
Have you been to Camp Humphreys?
No, I haven't.
You should go there. It's an outstanding facility. I'm sure you've been, General.
I have, Senator.
So 93% U.S. Army base on Korean soil, paid for the Koreans. Do we really think, and maybe those statements, maybe the press reports aren't true, cost plus 50, are we driving our allies away from us in the way that Putin and Xi Jinping are probably cheering right now?
Yes, Senator, we won't do cost plus 50%.
So those reports in the press, all over the press, are incorrect?
They're erroneous. We're not, we're not going to run a business and we're not going to run a charity. The important part is that people pay their fair share, and payment comes in lots of different forms. Could be contributions, like in Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, people need to carry their fair share, and not everyone can contribute. But it is not about cost plus 50%.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Shanahan, the recently released Missile Defense Review directed a study on operationalizing the Aegis Ashore site at the Pacific Missile Range Facility, PMRF, on Kauai. You and I discussed this. I have some significant concerns about what operationalizing the site would do to PMR's ability to meet its testing mission, which I assume you agree is important. You can...
Yeah, no, absolutely, Senator. And
thank you. I'll get to the question.
All right.
As well as the impact of removing that testing capacity from PMRF. So briefly, could you tell us how operationalizing the Aegis Ashore site in Kauai would add to our ability to defend Hawaii from missile threats, especially as the major missile threat to Hawaii would be an ICBM, and the Aegis Ashore is not set up to counter ICBMs?
My understanding of the request in the MDR is that it's a study to assess taking the test assets and operationalizing them. And as you well point out, the ground-based mid-course defense system that is resident in Alaska defends Hawaii. I believe that the study will look at what are other threats that may be posed to Hawaii and how there might be a layered defense. But as you pointed out, the test range there is vital capability and capacity for developing our missile defense systems.
So I want to make sure that my concerns are in the record. For Secretary Shanahan and General Dunford, 2 weeks ago, before this committee, General O'Shaughnessy, the Northern Command commander, testified that the current situation at our southern border is, to quote him, not a military threat. Do you agree, Secretary Shanahan, that the situation in the southern border is not a military threat?
Senator, you're referring to General O'Shaughnessy's testimony?
Yes.
Yeah. What I recall from his testimony is he said that it is not a military threat. He said border security is national security.
I understand that, but he said specifically that it's not a military threat. I'm asking you whether you agree with him that it's not a military threat.
I agree with him.
General Dunford?
I agree. It's a security challenge, not a military threat.
So you testified, Mr. Secretary, that there are 6,000 troops currently deployed at our southern border. Can you tell us how long they're going to be there?
I'd say 30 or 40% of them will be departing in the next month or so when they complete some of their work, and I believe we'll probably draw down to between 3,000 and 4,000.
Is this something that the President is indicating to you, or can he say that I want you all to remain at the border?
No, this was part of the tasking from the Department of Homeland Security, and based on their request to us.
From the President? From
the Department.
Yes. Let me get on to a matter that is of great concern to a lot of us, actually. Secretary Shanahan, in your response to Senator Inhofe's question about refueling the Truman, you stated that growing the workforce in the shipyard is a priority, and the move to not refuel the Truman would save $3.4 billion over 5 years. And how does canceling 3 years of shipyard work grow the workforce there?
Yeah, the workforce, when we look at what is in the shipyards, so the combination of submarines, new carriers, and then maintenance, all that is done in the same shipyards, and that workforce moves from project to project. So when we look at the total employment, the actual total employment goes up over the period of time in which we're building the two carriers.
Frankly, as I talk with some of the people from the shipyards, I'm not so sure that that is the case. And it'll cost about $3.4 billion to refuel the Truman, which, by the way, by not refueling, we're only getting about 50% of the Truman's service life. So at the same time, there's $3.6 billion in the emergency fund, which you acknowledge is going to be set aside. You want us to authorize setting that aside for the wall. So doesn't it make sense, maybe I should ask this of General Dunford, that we should use the money from the emergency funding that you're requesting us to set aside for the wall for something, i.e. the refueling of the Truman, that actually fits with the NDS and that your combatant commanders want. General Dunford, would you like to respond?
Senator, I would, and I'm not trying to be evasive, but I think my responsibility is to identify for the Secretary the priorities within our top line, not to identify what the top line is and not to identify how the money within the total top line ought to be allocated.
Well, I would say probably if you all had your druthers, if you could get some money to refuel the Truman, you would do so, wouldn't you?
Again, if I look at it through the military dimension alone, that would be true, but I have to acknowledge that the Secretary and the President have broader responsibilities than I do.
Thank you.
Yes, like building a vanity wall. Thank you.
That's one option. Okay, Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today. Mr. Secretary Shanahan, in 1990, Congress passed a law that required the administration to produce an audit of the Department of Defense. I want to give you guys kudos for producing the first ever audit of the Department of Defense last year in November. Thank you for that. Can you give us an update on that? Give us a little idea of what the Department is learning from that audit. I know we don't have a clean audit yet. Secretary Norquist may want to comment on that. But I'd like to get a brief update about what we're learning, what kind of opportunities we have for efficiencies and better use of capital in the military.
Thank you, Senator. First of all, the audit was to look at $2.7 trillion worth of assets. So this was the largest audit ever conducted, probably in the history of mankind. We were asked, would we ever do this? Because it had never been done. We made the commitment to this committee that it would be accomplished. We always knew that there would be discoveries, but audits really aren't about doing the audits. It's finding the problems, as you pointed out. And we specifically focused on identifying certain problems that are vital to operating the department. Some of them are financial and benefit, as you described, efficiencies, but others are identifying cyber shortfalls. So we use the audit to find efficiencies, vulnerabilities from cyber, as well as where there is non-compliance. The best part of the audit is we've identified those items, and now we're incorporating all the corrective actions. We're building the muscle movement and the habits to continuously close those, address those findings and make ourselves better. Dave, would you like to talk about the efficiencies?
Sure. So I think one of the things you point out is before we started the audit, there was sort of two potential misconceptions. One is it was going to be a paperwork exercise, and we'd learn nothing. Or the other is we'd open the floors and discover pots of gold hidden underneath. And, of course, part of the value of getting through is you moved past those to discover the tangible value. And let me just give a couple of specific examples. The first is inventory. We discovered there are certain facilities where what they thought they had in inventory did not match what they had in inventory. And if your responsibility is spare parts for airplanes, the accuracy of that inventory matters. And so, for example, at Hill Air Force Base, uninstalled missile motors, they don't just check the quantity, they check the condition. They were labeled as unserviceable. When you visit them and look at them, they're actually usable, and so you wouldn't have needed to order more. That saved us $53 million. Other places, you go to Osan and Kadena, 14,000 munitions, $2.2 billion, 100% accounted for, not a single exception. And so what we learned is there are some places that are doing this quite well, and there are others where we need to either help them fix their process or give them better attention. But the commanders in the field recognize the direct correct connection to mission and readiness, and so I had expected a lot of pushback once the audit findings came in that this was just paperwork, but they saw the tangible value. And I think as we move forward, the accuracy of the data, adopting more business-like practices will be tremendously helpful for the department.
Thank you. And how long will it take us to get a clean audit, in your estimate?
I don't know how long the department, because the department's opinion will be the last of the organizations, but I think over the next couple of years, you'll see either the Working Capital Fund or the Army or the Marine Corps start to get to clean opinions, and then you'll be able to differentiate between which of the organizations missing progress and who needs an extra hearing.
Thank you. Chairman Dunford, today we have about 5,000 troops, I think, directionally in Iraq. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
And so General Thomas recently, before this committee, the combatant commander of SOCOM said, and I quote, "Our Iraqi partners have embraced their sovereign responsibility in terms of defending their terrain." What are we doing? And also, we hear about this potential vote in the parliament in Iraq about asking U.S. forces to leave Iraq. And then just this week, we had President Rouhani visiting Prime Minister Mahdi. Can you talk to us a little bit about what assumptions we have in this budget with regard to our presence in Iraq, and how do you see our continuing role there in Iraq?
Senator, this budget includes an enduring presence in Iraq, slightly less than the forces that are on the ground right now. But what's important is that we do that in partnership with the Iraqi government. So as the Iraqi government settles and they're prepared to enter into a conversation about what our reliable partnership will be moved forward, then our Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense will work out the exact numbers to meet the requirements that the Iraqi security forces will still have to ensure the lasting defeat of ISIS, which, of course, is our collective focus.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Perdue. Senator King.